If I give you information tonight that is not factual, that is not backed up, I will tell you this is opinion. So you will know as I go through this what is backed up, what is factual, what is written down and stood over by people, and what is my deduction.
Hey guys, happy Monday. Man, I got a great one for you today. So Eddie Hobbes, an Irish celebrity, investment guy, doing fantastic work on the World Health Regulations and pandemic treaty and all these very threatening things that are coming our way. So he did a fantastic booked out talk down in Cork in Ireland, and there were hundreds of cars, I believe, turned away from the car park in the Silver Springs Hotel, packed the venue out. And his superb, humorous and engaging talk was recorded, and you can see it here now, and he goes through everything. So basically leveraging Dr. Nordengard and many other great researchers, he gives the full story of how the world works, where we're going and how we stop it.
It's an extraordinary privilege, and I'm quite emotional to be sitting here and seeing such a sea of faces in my home city. I had a feeling it would happen, and it happened. And I can tell you, it didn't start tonight, I know that, but something is starting here tonight, and it's starting where it should start, in Cork. I want to slay a few dragons first, at the start of this discussion. I want to tell you that, when you feel something is wrong, your intuition is correct. You don't have all the details, I know that. I don't have all the details, but I have 3.5 years of examination gone into this, and I didn't come to these conclusions lightly. And I'm going to give you information tonight. Some of it you're going to find quite upsetting, because I did. You're going to go through that journey, and you're going to be angry, and you're going to find some of this stuff disbelievable. Well, firstly, what I can say with absolute, utter conviction and fact is that the legacy media in Ireland are colluding to deny the Irish people unbelievably important information. I can tell you, because it's happened to me on 4 occasions in the last number of months, where I've been told that this radio station or this publication will not cover what's going on in the World Health Organization, where we are a goddamn member. It was a real scramble then over the weekend when the World Health Organization, which had basically gone to ground for 1.5 years, released these 2 documents. They'll be up on the website, and I'll be talking about them here tonight. I actually have them here, plus all my notes. Not that I'll need them, because I have it more or less memorized now at this stage. I've been through it so often. If I give you information tonight that is not factual, that is not backed up, I will tell you this is opinion. So you will know as I go through this what is backed up, what is factual, what is written down and stood over by people, and what is my deduction. When Italy went into lockdown, I knew straight away it was going to be a massive financial event. And I was amazed. I was absolutely gobsmacked at the start at the amount of the complete desertion of journalism, of the fourth estate in Ireland, deserted the Irish people almost instantly. I managed to get 1 3/4 page analysis into the Irish Examiner, and that was it. I was then on the fatwa list from then on. It was classic Irish shadow banning. Nobody talked about it. It was just understood in the ether. It was clear to me that the civil service were leaking information to the Irish Times. There was no journalism involved, to give them an idea what the government were thinking of doing the next day. The Irish Times then would put it on its front page as almost investigative journalism piece, when in fact it was a leak. And then RT, which sets the news agenda in the concrete bunker in the radio station, in the radio centre, would pick it up as it says in the newspapers. And the lead item would be that item. And for the entire day, the Irish political establishment and the civil service would get some sense of the antenna, the impact it was going to have on the public. It was pure propaganda. So I went and I checked it out. And I know from a very senior source that the key presenters in RT were brought into a meeting and told how all this was going to go down. So the fourth estate in Ireland died in January, February, March 2020, and it hasn't come back since. It hasn't come back since. And when I'm finishing this, I'm going to make a suggestion to those that want to take it up on how we send them a message, because we can send them a message by stopping clicking on their websites. They need to understand that democracy is when the government are afraid of the people, and not when the people are afraid of the government. So I'm going to do this talk in chunks. I just want to tell you what they are in advance. I'm going to set the scene firstly, then I'm going to talk about globalists and globalism and who's doing what and why. Then I'm going to talk about the financial system and what's going on there with some vital information. Today I emailed the governor of the central bank asking him questions about this. It's that serious, which I'll come on to. Then I'm going to talk about the psychops, the psychological operations that we've all been under. I want to tell you that I was also that soldier. I could quickly see the financial damage and all the rest of it, and I'd written about it. But then, of course, like everybody else, I was plugged in, made sit down and watch at 7 o'clock every evening, the two vampires coming out from the latest NEFID meeting, Bowers and Lee. They would come out of the NEFID meeting absolutely shaking with terror and pass on whatever the foreboding information was. And we were all wondering why we were suffering from free-floating anxiety. And I'll be getting into the detail on this in a while. The World Health Organization itself and all of the science said you do not lock down societies for a respiratory virus. You do not do that, because you create more damage if you do that than if you just let it run through, because it's going to go through anyway. And that didn't happen, and I'm going to explain why, who and where. I was asked to chair a sitting, a round table discussion involving a bunch of doctors, an actuary, a statistical science, which was Ivor Cummins. That's when I met him for the first time, and in a doctor's room, in a doctor's house in Wicklow. So I went along. I said, yes, of course I'll do it. And I walked in, and everybody knew each other, and they were shaking hands, and they were hugging, and their children were running around. And I was absolutely stunned. And then I almost stepped out of my own body and looked at myself and went, you gobshite, you've been hypnotized. I was also deeply affected by the psychological operation. It had nothing to do with intelligence or anything like that. It's just that's what happened. The first thing is that 1961, this is what Eisenhower said, and it's an absolutely vital piece of information. He said this as he was stepping down as US president. Remember, this is the man that had organized the D-Day landing. So this guy knew the American military and industrial complex inside out and back to front. And he's basically warned the American people that there is a state within the state, and that this needs to be kept a very close eye on. A few years later, his successor was assassinated in Dallas. When he was assassinated in Dallas, the Warren Commission was formed, which agreed that there was just one single shooter. At that stage, what happened was the CIA itself, and that's the number of the protocol, 1035-960. This came out in a New York Times Freedom of Information inquiry in 1976, and it appears in a book called Conspiracy Theory in America by Lance DeHaven Smith, published in 2013. And that's what it said. The term critical thinker was switched around, CT, critical thinker, into conspiracy theorist. And they were subject to this, because the same thing happened again when COVID hit, and I'll explain why and how as we move along. So my whole plan here, just as I did with Rip Off Republic, is just to join the dots, to tell the arc of the story. I'm just going to leave that up because it doesn't require any explanation. This is from one of the Rockefellers. But he's basically saying that the supranational sovereignty of an intellectual elite and world bankers is surely preferable to the national auto-determination practiced in past centuries. What does he mean, past centuries? We're a democratic republic. He's telling us that their ambition and his ilk is for one world, centralized administration, unelected, with them in charge, and us basically as the battery hens. People find this hard to grasp. That ambition is being long in gestation, cross generations. The first thing is that this is an old ideology. It's rooted in feudalism and aristocracy. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the British Empire did collapse, but it didn't entirely collapse. It changed its nature from a land-based empire to a financial empire. And while the First World War was raging, a British agent who had a very close ear with Woodrow Wilson translated policy of the Royal Institute of Foreign Affairs to set up the League of Nations. It needed to come from an American rather from them. And the League of Nations was the start of the thinking. And their plan was, we don't need to conquer the world by putting boots on the ground. We can actually do it by creating interdependent trade between nations and then being in charge of the gateways in and out, and especially of the banking system. And the conduit for those two things still exists, which is the Council for Foreign Relations in the United States, which was set up by the British on their advice, and the Royal Institute of Foreign Affairs. The WHO was set up in 1946 or so. It was set up with a grant from Rockefeller's father. And the land was donated, the land in New York, for the headquarters. So these organisations were very much part of the long-term plan to have an infrastructure in place which would lead eventually to a centralised one world administration. This slide actually explains the structure. Let me just run you through it. At the very top of this process, you have the Bank for International Settlements, which was set up in the early 1930s. And this is the central bank. And it decides international finance and policy, which I'll be coming to shortly. Underneath that, then you have the individual central banks, the Fed, the ECB, and so on. They set policy, but more than that, they actually set the rules for how the global financial system operates, and then they implement it. And then underneath that, then you have the policymakers, which is the World Economic Forum, which was set up in the early 1970s. I'll be coming to that in a moment. You'll see here the Council for Foreign Relations and the Rockefeller Foundation, and over next to that you have the Club of Rome. The Club of Rome, which existed for quite a while. I'll be talking about them a little bit as well. Underneath that, then you have policy distributors. They distribute the policy. The World Bank, the United Nations, and the World Health Organization. So that's where the World Health Organization sits in the process of power. And you can see it's not at the top. It's a delivery vehicle for other powers that exist behind it. And then you have the policy enforcers. And who are in the policy enforcers? The national governments. They're the policy enforcers. Some cases, knowingly, in most cases, haven't a clue. Haven't a clue. And then, of course, you have the propagandists. And you have massive amounts of flows of money into fact checkers, the ownership of the media, and all the rest of it. That all happens at that level. And then, of course, you have the policy subjects who are sitting in this room with me tonight. That's how it works. That's the world, as far as I'm concerned, works. So let me just give you some of the flows. So here you have Rockefeller. Rockefeller hires Kissinger. Remember him? Yeah, and then this is what they wanted to do. They set out on their agenda. The Club of Rome was involved. The first global revolution. Look at the last paragraph. All these dangers are caused by human intervention in natural processes, and it is only through changed attitudes and behaviour that they can be overcome. The real enemy then is humanity itself. They had identified as far back as the 50s and 60s that the two ways to actually scare the world population into giving up their freedoms in return for the perception of safety was through pandemics and climate. And then, of course, Klaus Schwab. How many people here haven't heard of Klaus Schwab? Klaus Schwab really is more of a hand puppet. He's a distraction. He's the Bond villain in the Bond movies, rubbing the cat with the accent, the whole thing. But he's useful in the sense that he gives things away. You know, you will own nothing, but you will be happy. Here's the Board of Trustees. Now, do we see anything unusual about the Board of Trustees? Who's the woman in the top? And what is she now? She's the President of the European Commission on the Board of Trustees of the World Economic Forum. Who was in the Young Leaders Group recently, was in the news? Leo Varadkar. And he resigned after what? After the Irish people took the pitchforks out of the hay and put a run on him on the 8th of March. And anybody that was plugged into that could see that coming. We also have Christine Lagarde. Remember, she was the chief of the IMF. And I was always struck how amazing. She's now going to become the head of the ECB. So she's been in both very senior positions. All she was short has been the head of the Fed, right? So she's in there. And there you go, Al Gore. According to Al Gore, we should all be here in our togs and our snorkels. I don't have time to get into the whole climate change thing, but it's the exact same model. Now, this is very interesting. Eulogised in 2018. It's on the WF website. was Klaus Schwab's mentor, his mentor, who attended 30 meetings and sat on the board of trustees for about 17 years. Or Fine Gael, ex-Fine Gael Attorney General Peter Sutherland, who was the then chairman of Goldman Sachs. Now, you should begin to see the dots coming together. This is Peter Sutherland, deceased, in 2012, and reported by the BBC on the 21st of June as he addressed the House of Lords Committee on Migration in the UK. And he basically told them that the EU needed to undermine national homogeneity. Now, for those that don't understand the term homogeneity, it means one people. You need to undermine one people. You need to open the borders and let everybody in and stop filtering them on the basis of gaps in your economy that need to be filled. Let them all in, because in order to survive, Europe needs a huge inflow of migration. And that's what he was promoting as EU ambassador for immigration. Now, a lot of these things aren't delivered on the basis of binary thing of good and evil and cowboys and Indians. There's a very thin line, and some people think they're doing well. They're doing good. But actually, when you look through the fluffy language, you really see that you just follow the money. Mikey Aiden said that. He said, I went to look for the science. I couldn't find it. This is an ex-Pfizer chief. I couldn't find it. So I decided to follow the money. And then I found the science. On the cusp of COVID, on the 29th of December 2019, we had an article by Klaus Schwab himself. Came down from Davos, from the Olympus, and decided to address the people of Cork and Munster. To tell us that our Citizens' Assembly was the greatest thing since sliced bread. It was a model to the rest of the world. Do you know why he said that? Because it directly fits into stakeholder capitalism, which is what he's been promoting all the time. Stakeholder capitalism is a nice fluffy term for hollowing out representative democracy, for infiltrating unions and NGOs, and then with a small number of people, and then influencing government. It's not about the coming together of people that have been elected by the people into positions to make changes to policy. And that's what's happened. I mean, if you've wondered why are we pushing extraordinary sex education on our children, how did that happen? We all know teachers. Teachers aren't like that, you would have thought. But the unions let it happen. Because that's where the power is. It's with the NGOs. We found out the Women's Council of Ireland, all for a yes vote. And who put the run on them? The women of Ireland. Right? Young women and mothers, including my own mother, who's 88. I had an interesting meeting with her a few weeks ago. I sat across the table, and she looked at me. She's in good health otherwise, but she's a very bad back. And she just looked at me across the table and said, I'm not taking any more of those vaccines. All my friends, and she started to list out her friends who were talking about the same thing, the people that had died and the people that had been hurt and so on and so forth. And I said, they're absolutely screwed now. The Cork octogenarians are on their case. So this is how it all comes together. So there is a mindset, there's an impulse on the other side of all of this. They are mechanistic in their thinking. They mightn't use these terms, but they believe that human beings can do without any spiritual side. That we can become transhuman, and that we can go into, that great change that's coming for humanity according to their thinking. And that mechanistic thinking goes through all of their policy themes, all of it. And this is one of it, and this is it. So what you've got here is the digital ID. Let's have a digital ID. Let's digitalize everything. Sure, it's wonderful if it's digitalized, isn't it? I mean, it's so easy. Just bring out your card. And into the digital ID goes your vaccine passport on the next pandemic. And by the way, that legislation hasn't been taken down. That's still there. In goes your vaccine passport. You can't go anywhere without your digital ID. And what else is going to go into your digital ID? Central bank digital currency. I remember writing about this 3 years ago. People thought it was nuts. And it's actually coming, right? It's around the corner. This is programmable currency by the central banks themselves. And then, of course, into your digital ID will go your personal carbon limit, which is coming in from another arm of the UN, because the WHO is an arm of the UN, which is the UNIPCC. I interviewed Professor Judith Curry, retired climatologist, who's written a book which I have actually got here. That's her book there. You're welcome to have a look at it. Anybody later on, Climate Uncertainty and Risk, Rethinking Our Response. And she's been hammered for it because she's telling the truth about what's really going on in climate. A lot of people are as well, but I'm not going to talk about climate tonight because there's a huge agenda on its own. I just want to say that the model is the same. Scare them, and then they'll fall into our lap. And why do we know it's a trap? Well, they've told us. This is the head, the chief of the Bank for International Settlements. Look at him. Just look at him. He's a former governor, central bank governor of Mexico. And what's he saying? Just look what he's saying. We're going to have absolute control over the digital currency. In other words, their plan is there's going to be no controls and there's going to be no national control. We're going to have absolute control. We're going to know where you're spending your money, who's getting it, and then what they're doing with it, which is surveillance. It's the ultimate surveillance. And the ultimate form of control is you own people's money. You own people's money, you own the ability on where they can move around because of carbon credit limits. You own their capacity to travel internationally because they need vaccine passports. And what's left? I mean, what's left? So I was over in Sweden for a 3-day conference in October. I met some incredibly interesting people, most of them written books, lectures and so on, all top of their game at the area that they were in. One of these was this guy, David Webb. I spoke to him again the other night in preparation for tonight's talk because I wanted to go through it again with him. And he's a very, very interesting book written, which is the book that I sent today to the Governor of the Central Bank of Ireland. Let me explain. So the actual value of all of the derivatives that are out there is 2 quadrillion. Does anybody know what a quadrillion is? Anybody want to have a go? It's 1,000 trillion. So there's 2,000 trillion. Now just look at the numbers underneath it. 2,000 trillion in derivative contracts, in derivatives. The total value of all the assets on the planet, 500 trillion, which is a quarter of the derivative mountain. And the total value of annual GDP in the world, 100 trillion. Now, there's lots of people in this room I know have been through the whole NAMA process or been through the banking problems back in the day. You know that those ratios are utterly, completely unsustainable. The estimated value of the derivative mountain by 2030 is 6,000 trillion. There is no way that global growth and global asset growth can keep pace with what's going on. You may say, well, what is going on? Which I'll explain now in a second. And what's very interesting about his book is that he has the evidence. All financial securities in the world, your savings, your pensions, everything is pooled, and it's in a digital pool. And then it just moves around. And the actual people that are custodians of the pool don't know you own that financial security because we digitalized everything. And therefore, you no longer have a direct ownership of your property. You have a contractual ownership. You have a contractual ownership. You are the entitlement holder. I'm going to slow down here now because this is a bit tricky for some people. You are the entitlement holder. Just as when you put cash into a bank, your cash is no longer in your account. They show your account and you say, oh, there's my cash. That's your money isn't there, so all your money's gone. It's the bank's money. You have a contractual right to call on that money from the bank. Doesn't mean they'll give it to you, but at least you have the right. But it's not physically in your account in that bank branch. It's the same thing, but just on a much more complex basis. In 1994, they started, and people say, who are they? And I say, they is the hierarchy exploiting you. T-H-E-Y. So the Uniform Code, Commercial Code, was quietly changed without acts of Congress in the United States, according to David Webb's book. Factual, backed up. And what happened was, property ownership rights were replaced with contractual rights. And it just happened without any involvement of the US government. They just did it. The EU then said, oh, the Americans have this way of doing it, we need to mimic them. So in 2004, they set up the Legal Certainty Group. Actually, it should have been called the Legal Uncertainty Group, but they always call something different from what it actually is. That's one of the tricks, one of the games you'll find. There is then an exchange of letters on the 6th of March 2006, which is the smoking gun. That letter, that exchange of letters is in that book. That book is on 1215 Tribes website as we speak. It's free, you can read it. And from page 69 to 98 is the exchange between the chief legal officer of the Federal Reserve Bank in New York and the chief lawyer of the Legal Certainty Group. And he asks a series of questions. How does it work? Please explain. This. You can just go down through it. It's all there. It's in black and white. And it basically confirms that there are no property rights in the system. So effectively, you'll see it in the dialogue, effectively, if there is a financial collapse of any of the intermediaries involved in that, and they're big enough intermediary involved in it, and they're undercapitalized, and you create a contagion, then all of the banks that have lent the money to the derivative mountain can come in and take the assets because they have been collateralized. They have been used, your money has been used as collateral, according to the book, as collateral to support investment in the derivative mountain, which is why the derivative mountain is going, because that's the banking system, that's how it works. They want to make money with other people's money without them knowing about it. What happens then is that from 2006 until 2014, the EU went about making changes to try and mimic the American model, and they managed to do it. So all of the financial securities in the EU exist on the exact same basis as the financial securities in the United States and throughout the Western world. There was 2 countries held out, Finland and Sweden, and they were targeted and they eventually folded, which is how these things operate. So what happened very recently, literally a couple of weeks ago, there's the letter, that's the holding letter, that's the covering letter, by the way, from the legal officers. So what happened is that David Webb and his lawyer gave testimony on the book, on the contents of the book, on the smoking gun, to the Senate in the state of Tennessee about 2 weeks ago. You'll find it online. But David tells me this himself. I was talking about it just the other night to him, but it's up on the website. So they actually outlined this evidence to the Senate in Tennessee, the state Senate. And without any bipartisan tension, the entire Senate votes through a bill in 2 days to change the way securities are collateralized in the state of Tennessee. The following day, the Treasury, the head of Treasury for the state of Tennessee, was threatened by the banking lobby and told all of the banks will pull out of the state if you do this. The first time there's a confrontation between a legislature and the banking system, and this is going to spread. So what's the solution? The solution is legislation which says that the original entitlement holder, the investor, has a primary call on his or her assets in the event of a liquidation, and everybody else is secondary. They're way down along the line. That legislation is required. It's required at an EU level because it's at an EU level that this was implemented against the understanding and knowledge of the Irish, of all people, and also of the financial services community, because this was unearthed. I didn't know any of this. That's why I wrote to the governor of the central bank. He mightn't know about it. He knows about it now. So I just want to switch gear now. I said I'd talk about psychological operations because we were all subject to it. But I want to first say that all of this is grounded in the work of this woman here, a marvellous woman, Hannah Arendt. Some of you may have heard of her. She came up with the term banality of evil. She covered the Eichmann trial in 1960-61 in Jerusalem. Eichmann, of course, was one of the chief Nazis, and he was kidnapped by the Israelis and brought back for trial in Jerusalem for his crimes. She wrote a book about it. It's a very, very interesting read. If you want to understand what the banality of totalitarianism looks like, that's it. She also has a big, thick book on, she studied what happened in Soviet Russia and what happened in early Germany all the way through to the taking of power by the National Socialists. Because there's no difference between fascists and communists. There's no difference. It's just a different set of thugs, but with the same idea. Her work became the lifelong work of this man here, Matthias Desmet. He is the professor of psychology at the University of Ghent. I have his book here. That's his book there, Matthias Desmet. You'll see all my books are heavily notated. I read them several times and go back over it again. So I'm about to tell you what's in that, because this to me was a light bulb moment. I couldn't understand why people wouldn't engage. You know, I was talking to a friend of mine And he said, Eddie, a very close friend of mine, said, I'm no longer following you on Twitter. And I said, why? And he said, well, because of your stuff about COVID and all that, you know. And I said, I'm just talking about, you know, vaccinating children is wrong, and the vaccine passports, the yellow passes, I call it leper pass, should have, you know, Michael D. Higgins should have never, that should have gone straight to the Supreme Court. And an amazing thing happened. He put his 2 hands up over his ears like that, 2 hands, if you can imagine. I had 1 hand. And he started to shake his head like a child. And I looked at him and I realized he's traumatized. He's actually in a state of trauma, you know. And I felt compassion for him then. And then I began to understand there's something here that needs proper explanation. It needs scientific explanation. And the science of psychology needs, I believe, to have its position elevated. So Desmond's book does that in spades. He basically describes how this kind of mass formation, this human murmuration takes place. He also has a quote from Hannah Arendt at the bottom there, which comes straight from his book. The moment Arendt had anticipated in 1951 seems to be rapidly approaching the emergence of a new totalitarian system led not by ringleaders like Stalin or Hitler, but by dull bureaucrats and technocrats. She wrote that in 1951. She's regarded as probably the most brilliant political theorist of the last century. So it's an imperious person to quote when you're talking about this thing at some stage in the future. He said 4 things must exist for mass formation to take place. The first thing is that you need to have about 25% of the population, say a quarter, with a generalized feeling of loneliness and isolation. The technology we use we're being streamed at. We're not talking to one another anymore. Websites don't have telephone numbers where you can ring and talk to another human being. It's talk to the bot, talk to the hand, talk to the FAQ, go to the website. So I'm not saying technology is entirely responsible for that or how we use it. I'm simply saying that it is a factor. So people feel loneliness, and then this group, and then you get a general feeling of meaningless and disengagement, that you're just sleepwalking through life. You know, you're living, but you're not really quite plugged in. You're not part of the gang. You're on the kind of periphery, and you feel isolated and lonely. And then you start getting feelings of free-floating anxiety, kind of a general anxiety, but you don't have a target for your anxiety. You just feel anxious. I felt that certainly during the Leon Bowers show. Right? My sleep was disrupted. My dreams were all over the place. My level of alcohol consumption went through the roof. I'll happily admit to that. I can see lots of people nodding around the room, but I won't ask the cameras to pick you up. And we went through that phase, flatten the curve and all of that stuff. And then Jerusalem, remember that? You know, we're dancing then. We were dancing to the fact that we were using masks that had no impact. And then you had the 2 meters distance. And remember then, there was people in the queue that would say, "You're not 2 meters. You're not wearing your mask. Where were you last night?" They were the COVIDistas. And they came directly from that 25%. Because they now had an object upon which to focus their feelings of isolation and frustration. And that's the third one. That they feel frustrated, irritable, and they have unvented anger. And along comes somebody and says, as Stalin said, it's the kulaks, the people slightly better than you, they're the problem, let's wipe them out. The Nazis said, it's the Jews. And the technocrats said, it's the virus and the people that won't take the goddamn vaccine. Right? And if the human immune system hadn't conquered their disease, we would be in a completely different world today. We were in a process that could have ended in very serious problems, just as other totalitarian regimes ended, because they eventually turn and not just suppress, but actually get rid of the object of their anger and anxiety. They just eliminate them. And then, having eliminated the opposition, they then turn on themselves. The whole system collapses because it's completely unnatural. He then says that, okay, so 20% of the population can see through all of this like looking through a pane of glass. But look, the science is, no, it's beyond science. Because what happens is that it's almost irrelevant what the centre now says. It's delivered by propaganda. The fact that even if they lie and they're caught out in the lie, the people that support them saying, well, weren't they very clever to lie? So you can't stand in front of somebody like that and deliver facts upon facts and science upon science. You're wasting your time. They're completely and utterly involved in a kind of a psychotic condition. 40 to 60%, which is the people I've been trying to reach all the time when I was campaigning on Twitter, are the people that smell a rat, know it's not quite right, but they're keeping the head down because they want the other fella to go down to the barricades and start causing trouble on their behalf while they have an easy life. Or they're working in the state sector, or they are reliant on an organisation that is compromised by the whole process. So they have to protect their families and the food on the table and their mortgages and all the rest of it. Totally understand it. But we're now post-COVID and they're beginning to wake up. So that's when, because I tweeted in the early hours of the 8th of March, I could see the crushing coming because I was beginning to see the 60% light bulbs going on. Not just about this issue, but obviously the whole issue of migration coming into the country, for which we can thank the great Irishman, Peter Sutherland. Now I want to switch gear. I'm going to now get into COVID and what really happened and what my findings are based on my research. Firstly, bioweapons aren't new. The first major bioweapon event that we know about in recorded history was in the port city of Kaffa on the Black Sea. That's in the Crimea. And guess what happened there? The Mongols were besieging the town and they just started to catapult in diseased bodies over the walls of the castle to try and break it. And of course it was successful. And there was a bunch of Italians inside in the port city and they decided to get the hell out of it onto the boat and back to Florence. And what did they bring with them? Anybody recognise the date? The Black Death, which wiped out a quarter of the European population. And that was a bioweapon, you could argue, in a very crude sense. We saw it again in Fort Pitt. British were surrounded in Fort Pitt by a coalition of Indians. And they broke the siege by passing through diseased blankets and caused a kind of a smallpox outbreak amongst the Indians and wiped them out. World War I, trench warfare. And we know all about that, gas and so on. So then we come to a Geneva Convention on Bioweapons in 1925. Of course, the Second World War comes along. The Japanese put a huge amount of investment into bioweapons research, and so did the Germans. So the Americans decided we better have our own bioweapons lab, so it's in Fort Detrick there in Maryland. It's still there. So they're actually developing bioweapons. And of course, what happens at the end of the Second World War? The Americans win, well, the Allies win. And what do? They get the best Japanese bioweapon scientists and the Germans, Operation Paperclip, and they bring them back to the United States and say, lads, we think you're wonderful. Keep going. We then come to the use of Agent Orange, which caused all sorts of problems for the Vietnamese population. And then 1975, there was a biological weapons convention. But what it did is it gave a loophole to gain of function research. You cannot have bioweapons, it's verboten. But if you're enhancing a pathogen for the purposes of researching the development of vaccines to control that pathogen, well, that's okay. And what did the military industrial complex say? Well, thank you so much. So Nixon spotted it and said, no, we're not having any of these things in our soil. Not for any ethical reason. He just said these things don't work. And of course, as soon as he's gone, they're back in business again. And so then we come to the Gulf War. The Gulf War, there's 170,000 American troops still suffering from Gulf War syndrome. Why? Because they were given a vaccine against anthrax. And they knew the specific anthrax, as far as I'm aware, that they were vaccinating against, because that anthrax was given by Rumsfeld years before that to Saddam Hussein to use it against the Iranians in the Iraq-Iranian war. There was no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq that the Americans hadn't given them. So what was the propaganda game plan? Well, here's the top 10. You hype fear of an imminent pandemic. You incriminate a pathogen. You exaggerate the infection rate. Massive overestimation on the amount of death, quite deliberate. You warn of mutant strains. You keep changing the story. You stoke hysteria, and you create a high level of anxiety in the public. See the link? Broadcast big lifestyle changes that are needed to protect lives, and you keep changing the rules. Keep people off balance. You inflate the prevalence with bogus amplification of the virus and inflate the death data. You attack counter-science like the Great Barrington Declaration, and you slander dissenters and as conspiracy theorists. allegedly, the CIA had allegedly funded Google and Facebook. They had with their own IP. Thought it was a great idea. They have a venture capital fund, and they put the money in, and then of course they were then able to use it then for their own technology, for their own surveillance. They were then able to say, we can now create regime change throughout the world using the elections as the vehicle, and we don't have to put boots on the ground at all. We can just do it. Isn't it great? Just our computer nerds can do it. And they were delighted with themselves, and one of their big victories was the Ukraine. Now, remember I said I would tell you when things weren't factual, we're now in the non-factual stuff, but it's logical, right? And then they got an awful shock when an event happened in 2016. What was that? Brexit. They didn't want Brexit to happen at all. That wasn't, we didn't do that. So there was another player on the pitch. So now they said, oh, now we've got to protect the homeland from the very technology that we were just using successfully around the world to psychologically influence populations. And then when COVID came, they got involved in protecting what they saw as the state, the United States of America, not the people, the United States of America, from the threat. And the threat was from doctors, scientists that believed in things like informed consent and the Hippocratic Oath and the science that you don't go on lockdown, which is what the Great Barrington Declaration was around. When that came out, Fauci got involved in a conspiracy, but this is by email, with his equivalent partner in the NIH, in order to completely denigrate those that are involved in the Great Barrington Declaration as conspiracy theorists. So you trample over informed consent, and then you vilify alternative existing drugs like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. Why? Because you cannot get emergency authorization for these new drugs if there is an existing medicine on the market that can be used. So therefore they were vilified. So-called competing news organizations were using the same words on the same day. I mean, it's so obvious, it's all out there. You know, you just Google it and it'll come up for you. And of course, they wanted to focus on the money, making the money, which explains why there's 19,000 members of the Irish Medical Council, only a handful of them stood up. Most of them were in the 60%, and the rest of them were being paid. Huge amounts of money pouring through the system. RT made a profit for the first time in its life because of the advertising from the HSE. The media revenues were boosted because of the advertising from the HSE. I mean, you follow the money, and you'll find the science. So this is the system. It's called a Hegelian parade. You create the problem, pathogen escapes. You create the reaction, drive the panic, and then you come in with the solution. And everybody buys. So how do we know that's the case? Even today, with everything we know, with all of the information that's pouring through all over the world about vaccine harm, about excess deaths, and all of the other things we all know amongst our own families and friends, we can see it now, we can feel it, it's in the community. All of these stories. Anthony Fauci comes in to Ireland. He comes into Ireland after 2 senior visits from the World Health Organization, and he gets a medal. From where does he get a medal from? The Royal College of Physicians. And who gives it to him? A Cork fella. And who's the other fella in with the picture with Fauci? What should have happened was that Fauci should have been brought to the airport and put on the next plane, to some place like Nuremberg. The whole thing followed the Gompertz curve dynamics. It was exactly the statistical dynamics of a movement of a virus through a population. And it wasn't being affected at all by lockdowns. The lockdowns all it did was change. You're still going to get it. It just changed the shape of the curve. And we were all being told, oh, let's flatten the curve. It was all propaganda. And the people that were telling us this were kind of stupid themselves, didn't know it. Or else they were caught in the psychosis themselves. The PCR test was inflated. The cycles on the PCR test, the magnification was inflated to between 35 and 45 times. If you magnify the PCR test, you can actually go and find the bubonic plague in your system. You can find the Justinian plague, perhaps, if you elevate it enough. So the PCR can be set to find anything. It is estimated that anywhere between 80 and 85% of the so-called cases of COVID were all phantom. Now just think about that for a minute. That means that we were following a phantom story given to us by our fourth estate without questioning. And when the information was being presented to the contrary, the counter-science, they were being vilified and attacked as conspiracy theorists, And now the data is all coming through, which clearly shows that what was being said, most of it, was absolutely accurate. And where is the explanation? There isn't one. And that's why I will not be let near a live mic on RTE. They're terrified. I'd probably die with it in my hands, right? So I want to talk about the run-up to COVID. Now, the NIAID is basically the regulator in the United States, and the chief at the time, of course, was Anthony Fauci. He was 40 years involved in the regulation of an industry. And you can't do that. Like, industries become captive after a while. You have to clear them out every 5 or 7 years, otherwise things become captive to the very people that they're regulating. So what's happening here is that the NIAID passes out largesse to professional investigators, academics, PhDs in visiting universities. They pay about $10,000, up to $10,000 for every human trial, every person. About 2/3 of that actually is skimmed off in overhead, and the rest of it goes into the actual cost. According to, no, by the way, where all this information is now coming from, just so that you're clear, it's coming from this book, The Real Anthony Fauci, by Robert F. Kennedy. Why is this book important? Well, you ask a lawyer. This isn't a normal book. This is a prosecution. It begins from the first page, and it builds and builds and builds and builds and builds. And there's page after page after page of notation. And the very interesting thing about this book is there hasn't been one single legal action in the United States of America against the content of this book. It's a Bible. This then came out a few weeks ago. The Wuhan cover-up. What I'm now about to talk about, the next number of slides, are directly from the research in this book. I'm very comfortable with what's in it because it has been proven already in the first book, The Real Anthony Fauci, and this book. And this is the same build again. It builds and builds and builds and builds and builds over 63 chapters. And you know what it ends in? The World Health Organization. That's where it ends. And that's where we're going to end. According to a book written by Fauci, about 20 years ago, Fauci was asked to come to a meeting by Bill Gates in his 40,000 square foot house. And they go into the library. This is in Fauci's book. And he basically says, well, Anthony, why don't we become partners? And they did. Which is why today the World Health Organization, 1/5 of its budget comes from the Gates Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is originally the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for Population Control. NIAID then gives the grants for gain-of-function research. And what happens is that the Obama administration said, oh, there can be no more bioweapons on American soil. So Fauci has the problem solved. He says, well, we'll move it from American soil. And where we put it? Well, what about Wuhan in China? And the Ukraine? They're interesting places. And in the Ukraine, the vehicle was, I think, a firm called the Eco Health Alliance, headed by a guy called Peter Daszak. And the money flowed to the head of that, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, Xi Zhenli. And meanwhile, back at the ranch, one of the professional investigators, Ralph Barrick, PhD, from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, gets over 30 million euros to do 5-year studies into the genetics of pathogens between 2012 and 2013. The ban comes in, he says, that doesn't affect us because we were already started. So he continues on. He files a patent in 2015, directly linked to the coronavirus spike protein. Now, I'm not a scientist, but I understand this is an unnatural enhancement of a pathogen for the purpose of making it even stronger. And that technology, after the patent came through, was given to Xi Zhenli in the Wuhan lab. And then in 2016, Mode RNA, recognize that, now called Moderna, changed name, patents spike proteins for coronaviruses research. 6 years after its founding, by this guy, Stephanie Bancel. I'll come to him in a moment. He comes back into the picture in just a second. Last year, they had revenues of around 7 billion. So what we now know, this is the timeline. According to an investigation by a Republican committee, and coinciding with the Chinese government raid on the Wuhan lab in 2019, it was September 2019 when the virus first circulated. Not later, September 2019. Very interesting month. In September 2019, the Gates Foundation put 55 million into BioNTech pre-IPO. BioNTech was a partner of Pfizer, and it had a technology that nobody else had. I'm just going to jump forward now a second. Gates then goes on a road trip for the next 2 years telling everybody these things are great, blah, 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 you should have one, blah, 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 blah. And he sells his shares in BioNTech in November 2022 for $1,300 million. And the same month says, do you know what? These things don't stop transmission of the virus at all. Sorry about that. We'll do better the next time. Within 6 weeks of September 2019, there is an event in New York, Event 201. It's set up by Gates and the World Economic Forum, and it games what a global pandemic of a coronavirus would look like, estimating deaths at 60 million. Just after that, we now know that Ben Hu, who is the second in command to Xi Jinping, goes into hospital, suffering from a mysterious virus. And there's a surprise. China then declares that there's an outbreak of this mysterious virus, the first death 12 days later. And in January 2020, the SARS-CoV-2 genetic sequence is released by China, but it denies that there's human-to-human transmission. Fauci then describes, on the 26th of January, describes the Wuhan virus as very, very low risk really. Next day, however, Peter Daszak, remember he's the guy that got the Fauci money and put it into Xi Jinping in the Wuhan lab. He says that, yes, the money did go from the NIAID into the Wuhan lab. So now Fauci's now is under pressure. And then the WHO then declares a public health emergency of international concern. I find this remarkable. When you do the numbers of PHEIC, what does it say? It says fake. I say it's a great description. Right? It's a fake. Somebody's having a laugh at our expense. Before I get to the 1st of February, in the middle of January every year, in a very swanky place in Europe, an event takes place. What is it? Davos. Well done, Davos, yeah. And they fly in there in their jets, and they meet at the World Economic Forum. And that particular year, somebody's missing. And who's missing but the head of the World Health Organization, Tedros, is missing. And why is Teddy missing? He's missing because, he's dealing with this problem with China. So who stands in for him? Jeremy Farrar. And Jeremy Farrar gets up at a press conference with a guy called Richard Hatchett. Richard Hatchett, who was in the American Bush administration 2005-2006, he publishes a paper which is completely contrary to all existing science, saying that we need to have a military lockdown in the event of a pandemic. This is in the post 9/11 period, right? We need to just lock down, use the military, bring in the army. He's then appointed by Gates as the chief executive officer of an organization called CEPI. And that's his position. We need to lock down. Hatchett is there with Sir Jeremy Farrar and Stephanie Bancel with the MNRA saying, we need to lock down. And all the billionaires are there saying, what did they do? We need to lock down. While they get back on their private jets. And of course, you had the whole pharma complex would have been there as well. It's the who's who of world business. They decided at that event that they were going to go into lockdown. Didn't matter what the WHO position may or may not have been. They just did it. Because it was predetermined. And then Farrar, on the 1st of February, he hosts a secret telephone conference. We know this because the emails were found afterwards. He hosted one with Fauci and a bunch of other people, basically saying, we have to put it about that this has a zoonotic origin. That some bat from this particular cave, 1,000 kilometers away from Wuhan, flew across China, never stopped, didn't infect anybody, and then flew into the wet market and infected somebody next door to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And said, what a good story. That was a cover story. So what happens is that they knew bloody well that there was a leak from the lab. Whether it was deliberate or not, we'll never know. But it came out of the lab. It's quite clear it came out of the lab. That it was genetically engineered and it was using Barrick's technology. That's quite clear to me. And then what happens is that they then get a bunch of scientists, 28 of them, to support that conclusion and to publish it in, I think it was The Lancet, or else a New England journal, right? One of these. Nothing to see here. Nothing. Definitely, there's no evidence of this. Until somebody then goes to check the 28 scientists and 527 of them are on the payroll. And where is Jeremy Farrar now? Does anybody know? He's the Chief Scientific Officer of the World Health Organization. He was appointed in September last year. And who's the tightest buddy he's got from his study days? A guy called George Gao at the China Center for Disease Control. And he's identified by Kennedy as involved in the leak cover-up on the Chinese side. So then they attack, hydroxychloroquine is attacked, but the paper that attacked it, this is in May 2020, is subsequently withdrawn, but it's too late, the damage was done. And then of course, ivermectin in August 2021 is attacked as being, you're not a horse. You're not a horse. And that was happening just as the Pfizer vaccine was authorized in the United States. So what you have here is regulators entirely captive to the pharmaceutical industry, which is captive to the bioweapons industry. Let's just look at this from their perspective. The benefits of this public-private partnership between the World Health Organization and the people that are feeding into it. Firstly, you don't need any morals or ethics. That's not required. You have an infallible risk-free model because you know you're creating the problem and you're creating the panic and then you're creating the solution. And it's worked already. Sure, look at them. Look at the sheep, 4.5 billion of them, myself included. You know, that lined up and stuck out the arm and believed the nonsense. So the pharmaceutical industry is completely indemnified by governments since the Reagan administration days. So they know then that they can plunder taxpayers through deficit borrowing. All the money was borrowed and it just transferred from the public, from us, from the taxpayers who borrowed the money onto their balance sheets, and a massive transfer of wealth. In fact, the estimate is 4 trillion. And that's the total amount of money that was lost, almost exactly, by the low to middle income workers throughout the world. $4 trillion. You can create global demand by creating mass anxiety. You don't have to advertise. You just create propaganda. And the mainstream media will do the work for you. You can rely on the regulators because we've got them totally captive, and they'll give you the marketing punch. Then you wash, rinse and repeat. And you work with nation states to weaponize the next one. So what are we looking at here? Well, Mussolini told us what it was. Remember what Hannah Arendt said? That the leaders of totalitarianism in the 21st century will be banal, faceless bureaucrats, or words to that effect. And she said it in 1951. So these are the 5 questions then I've asked myself. Well, these are the 5, I sat down the other day for an hour in preparation for this with a very interesting lawyer in Switzerland. And I went through the whole thing with him again. We were both 24 hours after this massive release of documentation, which I have here from the World Health Organization, and I was trying to get my head around it so that I didn't make a mistake. Okay, and I was exhausted at the end of the 2 days. I was probably a bit like a bear in a bear cave with a sore tooth at the end of it. But I got to the end of it. And this is straight from the briefing. So what are the 5 questions? The 5 questions that I've designed based on the briefing. You know, firstly, have you the capacity to self-authorize by mere declaration of a pandemic? It's the World Health Organization. Answer, yes. Are there any checks and balances over you? Answer, no. In fact, under the WHO founding charter of 1946, they're completely immune from criminal prosecution. Can informed consent be crushed? Well, of course it can. We've done it already. You know, when I sat down my own GP and I said, what's going into that? They didn't know. Nobody knew. They still don't know really what the WHO are now doing, and they're saying, oh well, this is not a treaty, of course, you know, this is not a breach of sovereignty. They're now certifying on the treaty that they've given us. They're now going to certify it. So they're now the gatekeepers of the vaccines themselves. So think about that. They're now the regulator of the entire system. They're the gatekeeper for what actually comes through. And they're setting that. What you're looking at here is the establishment, when you look at it altogether, as a kind of a mafia type organization, because that's what it is. No controls, free from criminal prosecution, and giving themselves all these powers. And of course we know that the psychological operations were successful because we all went through it. I mean, look, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands because it's a terrible question to ask, but if I ask for a show of hands, I'm sure that I'll put up my hand as one of the people that are here that was vaccinated. Some people held out, but they were a very small number of people. And I'm just going to go on one little tangent just to tell you this. This is a factual story. I ran across a document from another fantastic woman, Tracy O'Mahony. And Tracy had in her hand, given to her by somebody who obviously was listening to her podcasts, a letter from the clinicians running the organ transplant unit in Beaumont Hospital. This was weeks after the beginning of Yellow Pass, when I had said this is going to deteriorate. You don't realise we are heading for a disaster. I was amazed that the president passed it, but he did. This letter said, you are no longer allowed to be on the organ transplant list if you're not vaccinated. But a lot of these patients have been told you can't get vaccinated because your immune system couldn't take the shock. And I sent it that second to the second in command of RT. And I said to him, because I've been sending him stuff all the time, this has to lead as the main news item on RTE for the next 3 or 4 days. It is unbelievable. This needs to wake up the Irish people to what we're actually now doing, how we've descended. And I got back a reply, which I have still on my phone. He said to me, Eddie, don't bother me. I'm trying to get 2 journalists out of Afghanistan. Now my reply was going to be, that's a very good idea because there's none left in RTE. So now we get to what's happened. So basically the World Health Organization, this is the technical stuff, create 2 documents. They're changing what's known as the the International Health Regulations, IHR, which was founded in 2005. They want to change them. And what they did was very clever. They put out the changes about 1.5 years ago. And everybody's been focusing on documents from 1.5 years ago as if they were the current documents, but they weren't. The real documents only came out last weekend. And under Article 56.2 of the IHR, any changes need to be notified to members 4 months in advance of the World Health Assembly, which begins on the 27th of May. Now, for those of us who can do time calculations, there is not 4 months between last weekend and the 27th of May, so they're in breach of their own protocol that they have agreed with the members. Now, that's been notified to them, but they did it anyway, and we're supposed to trust them. So they brought out this new pandemic treaty. This is their logo for their next World Health Assembly, all fluffy and bluffy and all the rest of it. I'm not saying that the WHO don't do good work on the ground. I'm talking about the very, very top end of the officer class and what's really going on in the background and the connections. Now, these are the books that I've studied because I've mentioned those to you, but I just want to pick out some of the things in these documents here, which I've read in some detail and upon which I've received detailed legal advice. There's a lot more, but these are the pickouts. Okay, so I've already said that the WHO is in breach of its own 4-1 window, and I was right, Article 55.2. Oh, I said 56, I think 55.2 of the IHR's International Health Regulations. They have emphatic authority to declare fakes, pandemic health emergencies of international concern, or pandemic emergencies under Article 49.5 of the same regulations. Now, what's happened here is that the Director General has set up an expert committee. And who appoints the expert committee? The Director General. And then over here we'll have a review committee, like an audit function. Just audits it, you know. But under the existing rules, the Director General has emphatic control of calling for a fake. Now, this is very, very hidden, the way this was done. And so I didn't find this. This was pointed out to me by a very, very skilled lawyer. And he said, right, he showed me this, and he was absolutely right. Annex 1, page 45 of the regulations says it references multisectoral surveillance. You might say, well, that sounds good, doesn't it? Multisectoral surveillance, called the Global Genomic Surveillance Reports, which basically means they're going to put PCR into human waste in our wastewater systems to identify pathogens. Take those pathogens and then put them into labs that nation states themselves will develop, because they will see pathogens as a natural resource, an asset of the state. And because gain of function is not outlawed by these documents, it is thus within the law. So what they're setting up is for nation states now to partner in the finding of pathogens through the surveillance of human waste using PCR tests we know can find just about anything you want to set them to find out, and then to take that and weaponize it inside in labs, all for the sake of gain of function. Now, some of them won't do this, I know that, but lots of them will, because there'll be a race on for what? for the money from the pharmaceutical industry to partner up with them. But this is beyond the legal argument. Do you understand the point? This is beyond legalese. Let the lawyers battle it out in the lawyerly setting. This is about basic rights, human rights, civil rights. It's about the trampling of informed consent. It's about the complete abdication of the medical profession itself to stand up for the people, and the abdication of the Fourth Estate to stand up for the people, and the abdication of most of the political establishment to leave the Irish people down. That's what it's about. You have to be clear about what's happening. And what's their ambition? Well, their ambition is to basically create an open-ended assembly line of excuses to do the same thing over and over again, and to go from lab to jab in under 100 days. Now, I started this conversation, this discussion, by saying that this is coming under an impulse of people that think mechanistically. We are mechanisms. It's mechanistic. There's no acknowledgement of the human spirit, of God itself. In fact, they believe that we should all become one. That's an opinion, by the way. It's just in case you think that's a fact. So what can we do? Well, the first thing we can do, we cannot take these people on by being silent. Do you understand? We can start something in the room here tonight. There's enough people here to start it. We cannot take them on by being silent, but there's far more of us than there is of them. You have to withdraw your permission. You can't negotiate your way out of tyranny, because these people will just keep coming at us. They'll keep coming at us in different ways because they are driven by this impulse, this agenda that they're on. I took this photograph on the way down to West Cork a few weeks ago. That's me in front of my granduncle's grave. It's just next to his commanders, McSweeney and McCurtain. It's not a violent moment, but we're at a moment, we are in a state of conflict with tyranny. And we need to see it like that. The state of Louisiana, by the way, just in case you think that's an exaggeration, the state of Louisiana are already on the case. They're passing a bill which basically says, let me read you the small print, the World Health Organization, the United Nations and the World Economic Forum shall have no jurisdiction or power within the state of Louisiana. References. Well, I've told you about the books. I want to talk about the World Health Council, the World Council for Health. Very interesting organisation set up by Dr. Tess Laurie. There's an Irish council headed up by Holly Anderson, who lives down in Skull. It's well worth looking into. It's very much on the alternative economies, the alternative systems, the alternative medicines, the alternative thinking we need to engage in. It's not about taking on the fight, although that's happening as well. It's more about building something as an alternative. You have the Children's Health Defence that was set up by Robert F. Kennedy, and it's run now by Mary Holland. And again, a wonderful organisation. It's all over the world. I interviewed one of its key people, Shabnam Pelosa Mohammed. It's on my Counterpoint channel on YouTube before Christmas. An absolutely outstanding lawyer, a fantastic communicator, and a tireless worker. And you have people like that all over the world right now taking them on. The Japanese are taking them on in a big way. The Americans are beginning to take them on, and we're being silent. Yeah. We're being silent until tonight. Yes. These are fantastically well-informed people, in my opinion. All of them, without exception. I also just want to recognise somebody travelled here today on behalf of the World Council for Health from Dublin, because Holly Anderson couldn't be here. And her husband died having been excessively intubated from COVID, which should not have happened, and there was no explanation given to her. She doesn't want to be identified, she wants to maintain her privacy, but I just want to say what a wonderful thing to do, to travel down and tell me that story. Thank you. Finally, I just want to talk about this website because it's a catalyst. You can go anywhere you like, but this is a free. We just put literally. I was working all day, pinging forward and backward the development team to try and get this goddamn thing up and running. Money, hoping it's up and running. Some of the images on it are, from AI. AI generated images. They'll all be changed, but the narrative is important and the content is all there. It's called 1215tribes.com. 1215 was the year of the Magna Carta. It was when feudalism was broken for the first time. And it was from that Magna Carta that all modern constitutions flow.
That's why we're using the term 1215, so that will have global significance and people can use the website, they can borrow it, we'll give it to them, they can set up their own 1215 chapter wherever they want to set it up and put on their own content. The whole idea is to help people promote free speech and free engagement between ourselves on this agenda. You can also put 1215, I've already done it there, although I was admonished for putting hearts next to it, which I can't get off now. But you can put 1215 up on your profiles. The political establishment in Ireland lead from behind. So we just said, right, we're going here, you better follow, or you lose your seat. And they're in a febrile market at the moment, because of being barked at so aggressively on the 8th of March. What else can you do? Firstly, what you must do is fight. You cannot stay silent. Not everybody can fight as good as anybody else. Some people fight in different ways, but fight you must, because that has to happen. This has to get out there. You can start your own campaign. You can start a campaign, even if it's a small one, to demand a referendum on the WHO treaty, quoting Crotty from 1987. The Crotty ruling, where is it? It's up on the website. It's there. You'll hear me saying it on TikTok. You'll start talking about it yourselves. And before we know it, there'll be a Crotty on every lip in Ireland in a matter of weeks. And what will happen to the political establishment is say, do you know what, I think it's a very good idea to give them a referendum on Crotty after all. But right now I can tell you, because I have it on emails, they are taking what's inbound from the WHO. They already think it's wonderful. They haven't even read it. They think it's wonderful. They're just going to rubber stamp it and get on. Because we do that very well. We fawn very well, especially when you have a large pharmaceutical presence in the country. So if it's not up, it'll be up shortly with the database of the TDs and the councillors. All the rest of it will be there. Remember back in 2005, I'd asked the people to send nappies. Remember, because a nappy was an item under the groceries order. And they did, and there were thousands. And everybody thought it was funny until they started to send in dirty nappies. But in November 2005, a few weeks later, the groceries order was taken down by the government. It's been in existence since 1987. I said it on television at the time. The people that deliver the biggest bag of stuff in the corner will win this. We'll have a big bag, we'll have bags and bags of nappies in the corner of the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment, led by Micheál Martin at the time, because I put his address up on the screen. And that was the last time RTE ever let me do something like that. You can email ministers. And you can quote to them. It's up there. It's really succinct by Justice Hederman. I keep saying it because he brilliantly summarised it. A brilliant legal mind. And he said that the Cabinet are not the disposers of this Constitution. They're the guardians of it. They cannot fetter what has been unfettered to the Irish people in the Irish Constitution. They cannot. And that was it. It was just 2 lines. You can start asking hard questions when they come around to the door. There's plenty of material here to ask the hard questions. Most of them won't have a clue about any of this stuff. You realise that. They say the World Health, because it hasn't appeared in the mainstream media. This is the truth. What I've told you tonight is the truth, as I best know it. I have no agenda here. This is not commercial. There is no commercial agenda. There is no book I'm selling. None of that stuff, the stuff that will be flung at me. And all of the other stuff they'll fling at me as well. I'm here, warts and all. I'm no saint, but I am not a sinner. I'm doing this because it needs to be done.
So that'll do it, folks. Hope you enjoyed Eddie there. Great job, I think he did, on summarising everything and bringing in much needed humour too. So thanks so much, as always, to my Patreon and PayPal supporters. Great if anyone else can help keep this mission going. It's rather crucial, I do believe. And my Patreons, I do vlogs a couple of times a month with content. And once a month, I do a Zoom meeting that's open to the higher level patrons. So we can discuss any and everything in health, geopolitics, macroeconomics, etc. So thanks so much, guys. And till next time.